The emergency alarm rang through the great halls of the Galactic Engineering Council. 17 species had sent their greatest minds to this station, and none of them had ever heard this alarm before. It meant something impossible had happened, something that broke the laws of the universe itself. Chief Engineer Vorathnin moved quickly through the corridors. His long silver robes flowed behind him as his 4 legs carried him toward the central chamber. He was a Silithian, and his people had mastered the science of building things 40,000 years ago. Every bridge, every tower, every structure in the galaxy was built using mathematics his ancestors had perfected. There was nothing about engineering that could surprise him, or so he thought. The chamber was already full when he arrived. Engineers from a dozen worlds stood before a massive screen, their various eyes and sensors fixed on the image displayed there. Vorathnin pushed his way to the front and looked up at what had caused such panic. It was a bridge at first. He did not understand the problem. It was simply a bridge stretching across a body of water. Then he looked at the data streaming alongside the image. The length of the span, the materials used, the forces acting upon it, and his 4 hearts nearly stopped beating. This bridge could not exist. The mathematics were clear. A structure of that length, built with those primitive materials, subjected to those wind speeds and water currents, should have collapsed within hours of completion. Days at most. Yet according to the data, this bridge had stood for nearly 100 years. "This is a fabrication," Vorathnin declared. His voice was calm but firm. "Someone is playing a joke on this council. No civilization could build such a thing. The physics simply do not allow it." A young Mallory engineer stepped forward. Her feathers were ruffled with excitement. "Chief Engineer, the images come from our first contact team. They have just made communication with a new species. These creatures call themselves humans, and they live on a small planet called Earth." "Then your first contact team has been deceived," Vorathnin replied, "or their equipment is malfunctioning. I have spent 300 years studying structural engineering. I helped design the grand span of Kelos Prime, the longest bridge in the known galaxy. And I tell you now, what you are showing me is impossible." But more images began to appear on the screen. Not one bridge, but dozens. Hundreds. Bridges hanging from cables that should snap. Bridges arching over valleys with no supports in the middle. Bridges that seemed to float on nothing but air and stubbornness. Then came images of other structures. Towers of glass and steel that reached into the clouds. Tunnels that burrowed through solid mountains. Walls of concrete holding back entire rivers. Roads that crossed deserts and climbed mountains and stretched across frozen wastelands. The chamber fell silent. Every engineer in the room understood what they were seeing. Every engineer in the room knew it should not be possible. "We must investigate," said the Mallory. "We must go to this planet and learn how they do this." Vorathnin wanted to refuse. He wanted to declare the whole thing a hoax and return to his comfortable certainties. But he was a scientist above all else, and a scientist does not hide from evidence. A scientist seeks the truth even when the truth threatens everything he believes. "Very well," he said. "I will lead the delegation myself. We will expose this deception and put an end to this foolishness." The journey to Earth took 3 weeks. Vorathnin spent the time reviewing everything the first contact team had gathered about humans. They were a young species, barely capable of traveling beyond their own planet. Their technology was crude by galactic standards. Their understanding of mathematics was elementary. There was simply no way they could have developed engineering beyond anything the Council had achieved. When the ship entered orbit around Earth, Vorathnin looked down at the blue and green planet below. It was a beautiful world, he admitted. But beauty did not build bridges. The delegation landed near one of the human population centers, a city called San Francisco. And there, stretching across the mouth of a great bay, was the bridge from the images. It was even more impossible in person than it had been on the screen. Vorathnin stood at its base and stared upward at the massive cables and towering supports. The wind was strong here, coming off the ocean in powerful gusts. He could see the bridge moving slightly, swaying in the wind. Any proper structure would have been built rigid and immovable. This bridge danced. It should fall, he whispered to himself. It should have fallen long ago. Human appeared beside him. She was small by Silithian standards, with dark hair and warm brown eyes. She wore simple clothing and carried a flat device in her hands. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said. "I never get tired of looking at it." Vorathnin turned his attention to her. "You are an engineer?" "Civil engineer," she confirmed. "My name is Maria. I've been assigned to help your delegation understand our infrastructure. Then you can explain to me how this bridge exists." "My calculations show it should have collapsed within days of construction. The materials are too weak. The span is too long. The forces are too great." Maria smiled. It was a strange expression, and Vorathnin was not sure how to interpret it. "Your calculations aren't wrong," she said. "By pure mathematics, you're absolutely right. This bridge shouldn't work. Then how does it stand? Because we didn't just use mathematics. We used experience, intuition, generations of knowledge passed down from everyone who ever built anything and watched it fall down." She looked up at the bridge with obvious affection. "We built it stronger than it needed to be. We designed it to move with the wind instead of fighting against it. We expected the unexpected and prepared for things we couldn't predict." Vorathnin did not understand. Engineering was mathematics. Engineering was precision. Engineering was knowing exactly what forces would act upon a structure and building exactly what was needed to resist them. What this human described sounded like guessing. "I would like to meet the engineering caste responsible for this structure," he said. "The masters who designed it?" Maria laughed. Another strange human expression. "We don't have engineering castes. Anyone can become an engineer if they study and work hard enough. Actually, I designed my first bridge when I was still a student. It was a small one, just crossing a creek on my university campus. But the principles are the same." Vorathnin's translator flickered and reset 3 times as it tried to process her words. "Students designing bridges? No engineering caste. Knowledge available to anyone who wanted to learn." He looked up at the impossible bridge swaying gently in the wind. "And for the first time in 300 years, chief engineer." Vorathnin realized he had something new to learn. The galaxy's smartest minds were stunned. No one could explain. Human Engineering Part 2. Vorathnin had studied engineering for 300 years. He had designed structures on 40 different worlds. He had won the highest honors the Galactic Council could give. And now, standing in a small room filled with human documents and diagrams, he felt like a child who had just learned that everything he knew was wrong. "What do you mean, safety factor?" he asked. His voice was calm, but inside he was struggling to control his confusion. Maria pointed to a diagram on the wall. It showed a simple beam supporting a weight. "Let's say we calculate that a beam needs to support 1,000 units of force. In your engineering, what would you build?" "A beam capable of supporting 1,000 units of force," Vorathnin replied. "That is the logical answer. That is the only answer, right? And that's where we differ." Maria drew a circle around a number on the diagram. "We would build a beam capable of supporting 2,000 units. Maybe 3,000. Sometimes even 10,000, depending on what it's for." The other members of the Silithian delegation shifted uncomfortably. Kiva, the youngest engineer on the team, leaned forward with interest. But the senior members looked offended. "That is waste," said Engineer Torval, his scales turning a darker shade of blue. "You are using twice or 3 times the resources necessary. How can your civilization function with such inefficiency?" Maria did not seem bothered by his tone. "Because we plan for things we can't predict. What if the weight is greater than expected? What if the materials have a hidden flaw? What if something happens that we never imagined? The safety factor gives us room for error." "There should be no error," Torval insisted. "Proper engineering eliminates error." "Nothing eliminates error," Maria replied gently. "Error is part of reality. We just plan for it instead of pretending it doesn't exist." Vorathnin raised a hand to silence Torval before he could argue further. The concept was strange, but it explained something that had been bothering him since they arrived. Human structures were not elegant. They were not precisely calculated to the minimum necessary specification. They were bulky and overbuilt and seemingly wasteful, but they stood. They survived. They lasted. "Show me more," he said. Maria led the delegation to a construction site on the edge of the city. A new building was rising from the ground, its skeleton of steel beams reaching toward the sky. Workers moved across the structure like insects, welding and bolting and hammering. It was chaotic compared to Silithian construction, where every action was planned years in advance and executed with perfect precision. "Watch carefully," Maria said. A worker on the third level stopped what he was doing. He placed his hand on a steel beam and frowned. Then he called out to a supervisor, and a discussion began. After a few minutes, the beam was removed and a new one was brought in. "What happened?" Vorathnin asked. "Was there a calculation error?" "No error in the calculations," Maria said. "But that worker has been building with steel for 20 years. He said the beam didn't feel right. It probably had a small internal flaw that wouldn't show up on any inspection. But he could tell something was wrong just by touching it." Kiva stepped closer to Maria. He knew the beam was flawed by touching it. "Without any instruments?" "Experience," Maria said. "Intuition. Call it what you want. Human engineers learn to trust their senses as much as their mathematics. Sometimes your hands know things your calculations miss." This was madness. This was primitive superstition disguised as engineering. But Vorathnin could not deny what he had seen. The worker had identified a problem that no instrument had detected. The problem had been solved in minutes rather than the weeks it would take to recalculate and review on a Silithian construction site. Over the next several days, the delegation observed more human construction. They saw engineers arguing openly about design choices and changing plans based on those arguments. They saw workers suggesting improvements that supervisors adopted immediately. They saw decisions being made on site in the moment, without waiting for approval from committees or councils. It was messy. It was unpredictable. It was everything that proper engineering should not be, and it worked. On the fourth day, Vorathnin finally asked the question that had been forming in his mind. "Maria, we have studied engineering for 40,000 years. We have perfected the mathematics. We have eliminated uncertainty. Why do your methods work when ours say they should not?" Maria thought about the question for a long moment. "Maybe because you eliminated uncertainty, you also eliminated adaptation. When everything must be perfect, nothing can change. But humans live in a universe that changes constantly. We had to learn to change with it." That night, Vorathnin found Kiva alone in the observation room, writing in a small notebook. She quickly hid it when he entered, but he had already seen enough. "You are recording human methods," he said. It was not a question. Kiva's feathers flattened with shame. "I know it is not proper. I know our engineering is superior. But Chief Engineer, what if it is not? What if these humans have discovered something we missed?" Vorathnin should have reported her. Studying alien methods without council approval was against protocol. But he remembered the worker who felt a flawed beam with his bare hands. He remembered the bridge that swayed in the wind instead of fighting it. He remembered Maria's words about planning for error instead of pretending it did not exist. "Continue your notes," he said quietly, "but keep them private for now. I do not think the council is ready to hear what we are learning." Kiva's feathers rose with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you, Chief Engineer." Vorathnin turned to leave, then stopped at the door. "They do not use our mathematics," he said, almost to himself. "They use something called approximations. They estimate. They guess. And somehow, their guesses hold up bridges that our perfect calculations say should fall." He left Kiva alone with her notes and her questions. Outside, the human city glowed with lights, full of buildings and bridges and roads that should not exist. Vorathnin had come here to expose a deception. Instead, he was beginning to suspect that the only deception was the one he had believed his entire life. The belief that engineering could ever truly be perfect. The galaxy's smartest minds were stunned. No one could explain. Human Engineering Part 3 Maria led them into a room filled with old photographs and documents. The walls were covered with images of destruction. Collapsed bridges. Fallen buildings. Ships broken in half. towers that had crumbled into dust. It looked like a memorial to failure. "This is our history," Maria said. "This is how we learned to build." Vorathnine studied the images with growing confusion. "I do not understand. Why do you display your failures so openly? On Silithia, when a structure fails, the records are sealed. The engineers responsible are quietly removed from their positions. The failure is forgotten, so it cannot shame us." "That's exactly why we display them," Maria replied. "Because forgetting failures means repeating them. Every disaster you see on these walls taught us something. Every collapse led to better building codes. Every tragedy saved lives in the future because we refused to look away from what went wrong." She walked to a photograph of a bridge twisted and broken, half of it fallen into a river below. This was the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. It collapsed in 1940, just a few months after it opened. The wind made it twist and dance until it tore itself apart. 40 years of aerodynamics research came from studying why it fell. Every suspension bridge built since then has been safer because of this failure. Kiva was writing furiously in her notebook. The other Silithians looked uncomfortable, but they could not look away from the images. "You study your failures," Vorathnine said slowly. "You examine them. You share them with others." "We investigate every major failure," Maria confirmed. "Teams of engineers spend months, sometimes years, figuring out exactly what went wrong. Then, we publish the results. We share them with every engineer in the world. We teach them in universities. We write them into laws and building codes that everyone must follow. You publish your failures." Engineer Torval sounded horrified. "For everyone to see? How do your engineers maintain their honor?" Maria looked at him with something like sadness. "Our honor comes from learning, from making sure the same mistake never kills anyone again. The engineers who hide their failures, who refuse to learn from their mistakes, they are the ones without honor." She moved to another section of the wall, where a series of images showed a massive ship being torn apart by dark water. This was the Titanic, one of the largest ships ever built at the time. It sank on its first voyage because the builders were too confident. They said it was unsinkable. They were wrong, and over 1,500 people died. The number hit Vorathnine like a physical blow. 1,500 lives lost because engineers were too proud to imagine failure. "After the Titanic, everything changed," Maria continued. "New regulations required enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. New designs made ships harder to sink. Radio communication became mandatory so ships could call for help. The dead were not forgotten. They were honored by making sure their deaths meant something." Vorathnine thought about Silithian engineering history. 40,000 years of building. How many failures had there been? How many disasters had been hidden and forgotten? How many lives had been lost to mistakes that were never studied, never learned from, never shared? He did not want to know the answer. "We have a saying," Maria said. "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Our engineering is built on the bones of our mistakes. We carry the weight of every failure so that we can build something stronger from the wreckage. "But surely this must slow your progress," Kiva said. "All this investigation, all this documentation, it must take enormous resources." "It does," Maria admitted. "But it's worth it. Because when we investigate a failure, we don't just learn what went wrong. We learn what almost went wrong. We find weaknesses we never knew existed. We discover better ways of doing things that we would never have found otherwise." She pulled up a document on a screen. It was hundreds of pages long, filled with diagrams and calculations and photographs. "This is the investigation report from a hotel collapse. It took 2 years to complete. The engineers who studied it found that the failures started with a simple change during construction, a small modification that seemed harmless at the time. But understanding that one small change has saved thousands of buildings since then." Vorathnine tried to imagine presenting such a report to the Galactic Council, a detailed analysis of failure, published for everyone to see. The engineers responsible, identified by name, the mistakes laid out in precise detail. It would be considered a humiliation beyond measure. But what if the council was wrong? What if hiding failures did not protect honor but destroyed it? What if the true shame was not in failing, but in refusing to learn from failure? What if Silithian engineering had stopped improving precisely because they had made it impossible to admit that improvement was needed? "Maria," he said quietly, "how long have humans been building things? Seriously? Maybe 5,000 years? Less if you only count modern engineering." 5,000 years. Orth9 felt something heavy settle in his chest. "We have been building for 40,000 years. 8 times longer. And yet, in the past century alone, you have advanced further than we have in 10,000 years. Maria did not gloat. She did not point out the obvious conclusion. She simply nodded and said, "We had a lot of catching up to do." That evening, Vor-F9 called a meeting of his delegation. He showed them what he had learned, the history of human failure, the culture of investigation and learning, the refusal to hide or forget when things went wrong. Most of them rejected it immediately. It went against everything they had been taught. But Kiva sat silently, her notebook open, her eyes bright with understanding. And Varath9 realized that change would not come from the top. It would not come from the council or the senior engineers who had spent centuries believing they were already perfect. It would come from the young ones, the ones still willing to learn, the ones who could look at failure and see not shame, but opportunity. Outside the meeting room, the human city buzzed with life. Buildings stood tall that should have fallen. Bridges stretched across distances they should not have been able to span. And somewhere in the archives, the stories of every disaster were waiting to teach anyone willing to listen. The galaxy's smartest minds were stunned. No one could explain. Human engineering part for the ground began to shake at exactly 7:42 in the morning. Vorthnin was in his quarters reviewing notes when the first tremor hit. He grabbed the edge of his desk as the room swayed around him. Books fell from shelves. Equipment crashed to the floor. Through the window, he could see the buildings of the city moving like trees in a strong wind. Then, as quickly as it had started, the shaking stopped. His communicator buzzed immediately. Maria's voice came through, urgent but controlled. "Chief Engineer, are you injured?" "No." "What was that?" "Earthquake. A big one. Preliminary readings say magnitude 7.2. There was a pause, and he heard other voices in the background. "I have to go. There will be damage to assess, possibly people trapped. You're welcome to come with me if you want to see how we respond." Orithnin did not hesitate. "I will meet you outside." The scene in the streets was controlled chaos. Emergency vehicles moved through the roads, their lights flashing. People poured out of buildings, some calm, others frightened. But what struck Vorthnin most was the buildings. Themselves, they were still standing. He had felt the power of that earthquake. He had seen the ground move. By every calculation he knew, structures made of stone and glass and steel should have shattered under such force. But building after building stood intact, their windows unbroken, their walls straight and true. He whispered. Maria was already moving toward a vehicle. "Get in. I'll explain on the way." As they drove through the city, she talked quickly. "Earthquake engineering is one of our specialties here. California has major fault lines running through it. We've been dealing with earthquakes for as long as we've been building." "But the force," Voreth9 protested. "The energy released by an earthquake of that magnitude should have leveled everything." "It would have if we built things the way you do." Maria pointed to a tall building they were passing. "See how it's swaying slightly? It's still moving from the earthquake. That's intentional. We build our tall buildings on special foundations that let them move with the ground instead of fighting against it." Vorth9 stared at the swaying building. "You build structures that move. We build structures that survive. Sometimes that means being rigid. Sometimes that means being flexible. It depends on what forces you're dealing with." She smiled slightly. "You can't fight an earthquake. The energy's too great, so we don't try to fight it. We redirect it, absorb it, roll with it." They arrived at a neighborhood where the damage was more visible. Some older buildings had cracks in their walls. A few had partially collapsed. Emergency workers were already on the scene. Checking structures and helping residents, Maria jumped out of the vehicle and immediately began examining a damaged building. She ran her hands along the cracks, peered at the foundation, and made notes on her device. Other engineers arrived and joined her. They worked quickly, efficiently, making decisions on the spot. Kiva had followed in another vehicle. She stood beside Vorath 9, watching the organized chaos with wide eyes. "They know exactly what to do," she said. "There is no waiting for orders, no consulting with councils. They simply act." "They have done this before," Vorath 9 replied. "Many times, I suspect. They have failed and learned and prepared." A construction worker approached Maria with a concern about a support beam. She listened, asked questions, and then made a decision. Within minutes, temporary supports were being installed. The damaged building would not collapse today. Chief Engineer Kiva said quietly, "I need to help them." Vorath 9 looked at her. Protocol said she should observe only. She was a guest here, not a participant. Getting involved in human emergency response was not part of their mission. "Go," he said. "Learn what you can." Kiva ran toward the worksite without looking back. Vorthanine watched her approach a human worker and offer her assistance. There was a moment of confusion as the human tried to understand this alien creature wanting to help. Then Kiva picked up a tool and began working alongside them. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. More engineers arrived, assessed damage, and began repairs. Vorathnine observed it all, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. A school had been damaged. The roof had partially collapsed, trapping several rooms beneath debris. But the building had not fallen completely. Special reinforcements, invisible from the outside, had caught the weight and held it. The children inside had been frightened, but unharmed. "Controlled failure," Maria explained when she had a moment to rest. "We design buildings with components that are meant to break. Sacrificial pieces that absorb the damage so the rest of the structure survives. It's like how your body bruises to protect your bones. You deliberately include weak points? We deliberately include controlled weak points. The energy has to go somewhere. Better it destroys a beam we can replace than brings down the whole building." Vorath 9 thought about Silithian structures. Perfect. Precise. Every component exactly as strong as it needed to be. No more, no less. When they failed completely. There were no controlled collapses, no sacrificial elements, no graceful degradation. Just sudden, total destruction. As evening approached, the immediate crisis was over. The injured had been taken to hospitals. The damaged buildings had been assessed and secured. Life in the city was already returning to normal. Kiva returned to Vorathnine, exhausted but glowing with something he had never seen in her before. "I helped," she said. "I actually helped. We shored up a wall that was about to collapse." "A human child thanked me?" "What did you learn?" Vorathnine asked. Kiva thought for a long moment. "I've learned that good enough right now is better than perfect too late. I learned that experience matters as much as calculation. And I learned that humans do not plan for specific disasters." She looked out at the city, battered but standing. "They plan for the certainty that disasters will happen without knowing which ones or when. They prepare for the unknown." Vorathnine nodded slowly. "It is not engineering as we know it," Kiva agreed. "It is something better." The galaxy's smartest minds were stunned. No one could explain. Human Engineering Part 5, the delegation ship was ready to depart. Supplies had been loaded. Coordinates had been set. In a few hours, Vorathnine and his team would begin the journey back to the Galactic Council, where he would be expected to deliver his report on human engineering. He stood alone in the observation room, looking out at the city one last time. The earthquake damage had mostly been repaired. New supports had replaced old ones. Cracks had been filled. Life continued as if nothing had happened, as if shaking the ground beneath an entire city was just a minor inconvenience to be handled and forgotten. Maria found him there. She carried a small box in her hands. "I wanted to give you something before you left," she said. "A gift from my students." Vorathnine opened the box. Inside was a small model of the Golden Gate Bridge, the impossible structure that had started all of this. It was handmade, slightly crooked, with paint that was not quite even. One of the towers leaned slightly to the left. The cables were not perfectly symmetrical. It was the most beautiful thing Vorathnin had ever seen. "It's not perfect," Maria said, almost apologetically. "They're still learning." "Is exactly right," Vorathnin replied. He held the small bridge carefully, as if it were made of something precious. It is exactly what human engineering is. Imperfect, asymmetrical, built with care and hope rather than cold calculation. He looked at Maria, and stronger for all of that. Maria smiled. "What will you tell the council?" That was the question Vorathnin had been avoiding for days. The council expected a technical report. They expected confirmation that human engineering was primitive and irrelevant. They expected him to return with evidence that Silithian methods remained supreme. He could give them that report. He could hide what he had learned, just as his people had always hidden failure. He could protect his career and his reputation by telling comfortable lies, or he could tell the truth. "I do not know yet," he admitted. "What I have learned here challenges everything my civilization believes about engineering, about perfection, about progress itself. The council may not be ready to hear it." "Change is hard," Maria agreed. "But it's also necessary. Civilizations that stop changing start dying. You can't perfect your way out of the universe. The universe keeps finding new ways to challenge you." Vorathnin thought about his people. 40,000 years of engineering tradition. 40,000 years of believing they had found the final answers. When had they stopped asking new questions? When had they decided that learning was complete? "I will tell them the truth," he said finally. "Whether they accept it or not, they need to hear that there are other ways of building. Other ways of thinking. Ways that might seem primitive but contain wisdom we have forgotten." He paused, looking down at the small, imperfect bridge in his hands. "We eliminated failure from our records, and in doing so, we eliminated growth. We built perfect structures that never changed because we were too proud to admit they could be better. Humans build imperfect structures that constantly improve because they are humble enough to learn from their mistakes." Maria nodded. "Will they listen?" "Some will not. The senior engineers have spent centuries believing they were already perfect. They will reject what I say." He thought of Kiva and the other young engineers who had watched and learned during their visit. "But others will listen. The young ones, the curious ones, the ones who look at a bridge that should not stand and ask how instead of why." The departure alarm sounded through the ship. It was time to go. "Thank you," Vorathnin said, "for your patience, for your teaching, for showing us things we did not want to see." "Thank you for being willing to look," Maria replied. "That takes courage." They walked together to the landing area, where the rest of the delegation waited. Kiva stood apart from the others, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. She had filled every page with observations, questions, and ideas. She looked at Vorathnin with hope and fear in her eyes. He nodded to her slightly. Her secrets were safe with him. The journey home was quiet. The senior engineers discussed what they had seen in careful, neutral terms, unwilling to admit how much it had shaken them. But Vorathnin noticed them thinking, questioning, wondering. Seeds had been planted. Whether they would grow remained to be seen. When they reached the council station, Vorathnin gave his report. He spoke for 3 hours, describing everything they had observed, the safety factors, the culture of learning from failure, the controlled collapses and flexible foundations, the workers who could feel a flaw with their bare hands, the bridges that danced in the wind instead of fighting it. The council was divided. Many dismissed his findings as exaggerations or misunderstandings. How could a primitive species have discovered anything valuable? How could 40,000 years of perfection be wrong? But others listened. They asked questions. They requested copies of the data. They spoke quietly among themselves about possibilities and changes in new directions. Years passed. Slowly, carefully, ideas spread. Kiva became an engineer in her own right and began teaching human concepts to those who would listen. Safety factors appeared in a few experimental designs. Investigation reports on failures were quietly shared among trusted colleagues. Change came not as a revolution, but as a gradual shift. Like the slow movement of continents, then a stellar event struck the Kelos system. A burst of energy from the twin suns, unprecedented and unpredicted. Most of the perfect Silithian structures in the system crumbled like sand. Millions of lives were lost, but one station survived. It had been built using the new methods, with safety factors and flexible joints and controlled failure points. It bent and swayed and sacrificed its outer sections, but its core held. 300,000 people lived because an engineer had been humble enough to learn from humans. Vorath 9 heard the news in his study. He was old now, his silver scales faded to gray. On his desk sat the small model bridge, slightly crooked, imperfectly painted, positioned carefully inside a protective case of his own design. The case was overbuilt and asymmetrical. It contained 3 times the shielding necessary. It had survived the stellar event, without a scratch. He picked up the little bridge and held it gently in his ancient hands. Somewhere across the galaxy, on a small blue planet, humans were probably building something new. Something imperfect. Something that would stand against forces it was never designed to face. Simply because its builders had been wise enough to prepare for the unknown. The galaxy's smartest. Minds had been stunned because they had forgotten something important. Perfection was an ending. Imperfection was a beginning. And humans, with their crooked bridges and dancing towers and stubborn refusal to accept failure as final, had remembered what the rest of the galaxy had lost. The universe was not a puzzle to be solved. It was a challenge to be continuously answered. And the best answers came not from those who believed they were already perfect, but from those who knew they never would be, and kept building anyway.